say she said yes to this session. I am looking forward to listening to her share of wisdom and experience and the wealth of knowledge that she is carrying from the past decade of experience in the age group of birth to 6 years. So she is a passionate advocate for nurturing young learners, and I believe I am also trying to do similar things. I'm trying to achieve that at Little Leaps as well. So over to you, Mariana. But before you start your presentation, I would like you to share your story of how you delved into this world of Montessori.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, my name's Mariana. I know some of you, and good to meet others of you. Yeah, I mean, I got into Montessori from conventional education. So I was working for the local school district in recruitment. So I was helping recruit teachers sort of the in the highest need classrooms in Oakland. So we were looking for highly qualified teachers for the highest need classrooms. And I wasn't a teacher myself at that point. And I started to really go into a lot of classrooms and talk to a lot of aspiring teachers. And obviously, I was sort of immersed in the district life. And it became pretty clear early on that the model wasn't really working for anybody, right? So it wasn't particularly working for students. It wasn't particularly working for teachers. It wasn't particularly working for the district, and it didn't really appear to be working for families. So when I started to feel like I might want to be in a classroom, I might want to go into teaching. I didn't know that I wanted to go into conventional education, but I also didn't know what alternatives existed. And I just happened to run into a high school friend of mine that I hadn't seen in 15 years. And she was leaving her position at a Montessori school to go do her training in London. And she said, you should go apply for my role because I'm leaving in the next month. And so I hadn't really heard much about Montessori, and so I went and I was asked to observe a toddler classroom because that's where she was teaching, and that was the position that was open. And I was just completely floored. I was completely floored at the idea that 14 toddlers could just go about their day. Somebody was making their own snack, kids were chatting at the snack table, somebody was washing their dishes, other kids were doing a language lesson, somebody was painting. I mean, the teachers were sitting and either engaging with the children one-on-one, or observing or helping them with toileting in the bathroom. And I thought, wow, this is a model that seems really affirming of children. It seems really affirming of adults. And it seems really affirming in terms of the whole structure of everybody who gets in contact with it. And so I was really glad to be accepted for that position. And then I went on to earn my 2 degrees in Montessori. And the more I learn about Montessori, the more I feel affirmed in that decision, because I just feel like it makes so much sense. So that's a little bit about how I got into it, and I've been in love with Montessori since 2008 or whenever I first ran into that friend of mine. Um, so I'm so excited to be talking about this topic. This is a really big topic in the world of Montessori, and it's a big topic for me because I just love this topic. So I'm excited to share a little bit more with you all about punishments versus logical consequences. So as Madhuri shared, I run the PEACE program. So PEACE stands for Parent, Education, and Child Empowerment. And it's a program I started after I started having kids of my own and realized how hard parenting was without a community space to lean on. I felt very isolated as a parent. I didn't know who to ask. And certainly the internet will give you all answers under the sun. And every single one of those answers contradicts one to the other. So I felt like it was a really challenging space to be a parent. And so I started the PEACE program as a parenting support platform. And now I've grown to work with and support a whole host of educators. So Madhuri is one of our PEACE facilitators. We also have Mary on the call, who's one of our PEACE facilitators. And I started the PEACE facilitation team to make sure that the families in this platform with the PEACE program had access to Montessori trained support from a lot of different perspectives. So it wasn't just me that was giving support and information. education, that they had access to more educators from around the world with different perspectives, different language backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. And so I work with a team of 18 facilitators to help run 2 of our annual conferences. And you can join for free at join.thepeaceprogram.org. So today, what I want to do before we have our Q&A is I want to provide some context on some differences between conventional and Montessori education, and why, as Montessori educators, we care about the difference between punishments and logical consequences. I want to talk about some definitions, so we're all talking about the same thing, between, what are natural and logical consequences, what does that mean, and then what does it mean for it to be a reward or a punishment. And then we're going to talk about the basic framework that as Montessori educators we utilize to come up with the logical consequences when we're using that route instead of punishments. And then we'll break for Q&A. So to start with the context around conventional education as it differs from Montessori education, is the conventional model is set up as a top-down model with the teacher on top and the child or the student on the bottom. So in that model, the teacher is the knower, the teacher is the expert, the teacher is the decider, they are the planner, and the student or the child is the recipient of that knowledge, the recipient of those decisions, the recipient of that planning. And so this is a hierarchy-based model of education where the teacher is on top and then the student is sort of in the current of what the teacher is knowing, deciding, and teaching. And what is notable about a hierarchical model is that the hierarchy goes both ways. So in a top-down model, the child, the student, is supposed to deliver specific things to the teacher. And in this model, the child is supposed to deliver respect, compliance, and productivity. So the child, if they are perfectly respectful, perfectly compliant, but they are unproductive, they're going to get in trouble in this system. This hierarchy is maintained through what Montessori described as oppressive practices. So the idea that children do not have the freedom to just get up and move in their classroom anytime they want. If they try to do that, they will get in trouble, that they can't speak to whom they want. If they do, then that's considered disrespectful and they're going to get in trouble. That they don't have choice in their learning, that it is what the teacher has decided to teach them. And even if you love math and you would like to do more math at the 45-minute mark, too bad, we're switching to language, or we're switching to something else. So the Montessori described the restrictions on freedom, the restrictions on movement, speech, and choice as these sort of oppressive practices that help maintain this hierarchy with the teacher on top. And then in addition, punishments are used when the child is deemed disrespectful, non-compliant, or unproductive. So that's sort of a basic overview of conventional education. When it's set up as a hierarchy, you start seeing some of these practices sort of come inevitably from trying to maintain the hierarchy. So Montessori education is different. Montessori education is based on this idea of a triad. So you have an adult in the environment, you have the child or the student, and then you have the actual environment itself. So the triad is based on knowledge of how the brain actually learns, and the brain learns through experiences. I'm going to give you an example. So I don't know how to change a bike tire. And some of you might know how to change a bike tire. I don't. So if you were to teach me how to change a bike tire and just tell me about it with no bike in sight, and you just said, hey, do this and then this and then that. And then 3 weeks later, you said, hey, change a bike tire. I probably would not be able to change the bike tire. If instead you showed me the bike tire being changed while you changed it, and then you passed it to me and you said, now you repeat changing of the bike tire. If I did that, and then in 3 weeks you asked me to change the bike tire, I would probably be a lot more successful at changing the bike tire because it wasn't your lesson that actually taught me. It was the fact that you connected me to this experience, and the experience taught me how to do it. And so that's how the brain works for adults, and it works like that for children. And so Montessori education recognizes that and recognizes that the adult is actually not the one that instructs the child the child actually learns directly from the environment. So in Montessori, what we do is the adult creates an environment of experiences for the children to learn from, and those experiences teach the child. So the Montessori triad actually works the other way as well, because if the adult, if I don't have somebody to actually teach me about the bike and all I have is the bike, I won't really know what to do. I won't know how to change the bike tire. I won't know where to start. Um, so in Montessori, the triad also works in the other way, where the adult is meant to connect the child to those experiences that they may not know. So if the child doesn't know how to do a bow, then the adult will connect the child to the experience of tying bows. And then through the child's practice with tying bows, they will teach themselves through those experiences and then know how to tie bows. Not because the teacher taught them, but the teacher connected them to that experience. So connection on the other way of Montessori is a big part of how this method functions. And so in the method, how each of these parts are interconnected is based on the foundation of mutuality. So mutuality means that, the adult, yes, is connecting to the child, but the child is also building a relationship with the adult. The child is connecting to the environment, but then the environment is also teaching the child. And then the adult is creating the environment. And through that environment, the adult is able to have these connections. So mutuality is a big part of the Montessori triad. And what's highlighted within this idea of mutuality is relationships between the adult and child, experiences between the child and the environment, and then freedom within limits between the adult and the environment. Freedom within limits is the idea that everyone in a Montessori environment has the freedom to move, to speak, and to choose. Those three freedoms are enjoyed by the adults and by the children. Everybody has those freedoms. Those freedoms get curbed, these are the limits, if somebody is hurting someone, breaking something, or impacting the well-being of the entire community. So then they're freedoms, right? So if my movement, I'm free to move, but if I'm using my movement to hit somebody, then my movement is going to get restricted. So freedom within limits is a basic concept within the Montessori educational model. But the idea is that these basic freedoms and these basic limits go for everybody, right? If I expect you not to yell, I also am expected not to yell. So we have this mutualistic idea of how this works. Now, of course, adults have more freedom because adults have more skill, greater age, and are more responsible with the freedom. But it still is based on the same freedoms that the child has. So from the example of movement, the child has the freedom to move about their classroom. The adult has the freedom to move about the campus and also move off campus. So we all have the same freedom, but there are certain limits based on age, skill, and responsibility. So in Montessori centers that go through to higher ages, children who are getting more and more skilled, greater in age, and more responsible, they will have more and more and more freedom as they go through the program, even when the freedoms are still the same and the limits are still the same. It's just that the circle of freedom has been expanded. And so when you look at this model, and why I'm spending a little bit of time talking about this, is you can see that punishments don't work. It doesn't make any sense in this mutualistic model, right? Like, am I going to get punished the way that children get punished? Am I going to be asked to stay in the same chair at the same desk for hours on end, and not be able to speak out of turn and not be able to get up? Like, that the kind of restrictions that are in place in the conventional model and the use of punishments really don't make sense in a mutualistic model. And it's why, as Montessori educators, this model is designed specifically away from punishments and into what we call logical consequences. So we know what we're talking about. I want to provide some definitions. So that's what we're going to do briefly here, but we can, of course, talk more in the Q&A. So there's 4 kinds of consequences to behavior: natural, logical, rewards, and punishments. A natural consequence, I describe it as a what happens when. And I describe it that way because it's just this automatic thing that happens when something occurs. So if a child spills water, the floor is wet. there's not an instance when the child spills water that the floor is not wet. That's what happens. I don't have to make the floor more wet for us to see that it's wet. I don't have to do anything else. It just happened. So those are natural consequences. Some natural consequences we don't actually want the child to experience, right? So I don't really want them to experience what the natural consequence of falling off the cliff is. That's not going to be very helpful to them. So a logical consequence is something that I'm trying to get as close to the natural consequence as possible, when the natural consequence is really not advisable, or it's not sort of recommended that the child have that natural consequence. So this is a created what happens when. So we have to put in the work to create a logical consequence. It doesn't happen automatically. We want to try to make it happen automatically, but we have to do that thinking and we have to create that. And I have an example of a plate here. So let's say, for example, a child is playing with a breakable plate. So we could say, okay, well, I'm going to let this have the natural consequence sort of play out. And let's say the child, inevitably it falls on the floor, cracks, and breaks. If I give the child a new plate, let's say they're playing again with it, and they're not really learning what I need them to learn from the natural consequence. Maybe they really like the sound. Maybe they thought it was really interesting to break the plate. At a certain point, I'm going to say, I don't want the plates to keep breaking. So that's where a logical consequence can come in, is to sort of say, and the thought process of what we do is we say, all right, so what would happen in the natural consequence? If I let the natural consequence happen, what would happen? And in that thinking, we would say, okay, if I let this go on, the plate's going to fall off and it's probably going to break. Then I'm going to sweep it up and it's going to go in the garbage. So the idea would be is the natural consequence of breaking the plate is the plate goes away. So the logical consequence is going to borrow that idea, the plate goes away, and that's going to be the consequence. So if the child is playing with the plate, I would simply take the plate. And I have created a logical consequence from just thinking about what would have happened in the natural consequence while not actually having all of the plates break. So it's a created what happens when. And we don't need to preempt a logical consequence to sort of say, hey, this is about to happen. It's much more clear to the brain for the child to have actions and then consequences. So they're playing with the plate, and I simply just move it out of their way. When they want it back, then I can give a qualifier of, great, so you're ready to keep the plate flat. That's what I'm going to see. And they can try again with the idea that I can keep playing, taking the plate away, or deciding that we're done sort of practicing this because the child's not getting it right now. But that's the idea of a logical consequence, is it's trying to get as close to the natural one as possible. So let's talk about rewards and punishments. So rewards and punishments are also created. We have to think of them, but it's a what happens if, not a what happens when. There's a level of not unpredictability about rewards because it's unclear if they're going to happen. Whereas natural and logical consequences, they are going to happen. They just happen, whether we created them or they happened automatically. They just happened. Rewards, there's this something that's not constant. So I don't know if I'm going to get the stickers or not. I don't know if the ice cream is going to show up. I don't know if I'm going to get the toy. So rewards are created that are what happens if, that are good. And of course, the other side is punishments are created what happens if, that are bad. So rewards and punishments, Montessori had them basically on two sides of the same coin. That I'm dangling a positive or a negative incentive with the idea that I want to change behavior. So I want to talk about the three characteristics of what makes rewards and punishments not desirable, and the three characteristics of why logical and natural consequences work really well. And those three characteristics for rewards and punishments are, it focuses the child on the adult's behavior. So instead of the child thinking about not breaking the plate or keeping the plate flat, the child is now thinking about what you're going to do about it. They're thinking about the ice cream. They're thinking about the star. They're thinking about the timeout. They're thinking about the delay in screen time. So the child starts focusing all their energy on you and what you're going to do about it, which is not the direction of changed behavior. Changed behavior focuses on self, not on everyone else. The other problem with rewards and punishments is that they lose value over time. So maybe the child was able to listen with one sticker, but now one sticker doesn't cut it anymore. It doesn't have the same value. So now you need to do 5 stickers. And then that doesn't have the same value. So now you need to upgrade to a toy. Now you need to upgrade to an ice cream cone. Now you need to upgrade to the chocolate donut, whatever. If they lose value over time, and they have to constantly get these over exaggerated rewards. And I think what's more problematic is these over exaggerated punishments. If the child doesn't care about the 2-minute timeout, they end up getting these exaggerated punishments that do not fit the infraction, right? Like if the child is just messing with a plate and I move the plate away, that is a very stable value of just like, now we're sort of done with the playing and you could try again for a little bit and then we can be done with this, as opposed to having these, timeouts getting really long and, their favorite things getting taken away for really long. We have these over exaggerated rewards and punishments during this approach. And the last thing is they target the child. So if you have a child who loves dinosaurs and really doesn't care that much about dolls, loves dinosaurs, doesn't care about dolls, would we pick doll stickers or a doll for a reward? Would we take away dolls from this child as a punishment? No, because they don't care. We would pick dinosaurs. And so when we do that, it becomes hyper personalized on the child, which really erodes the relationship between the child and the adult because the child feels personally targeted and personally attacked by the parent or the caregiver. So let's take a look on the other side and why these two are much more desirable. Is logical and natural consequences focus the child on their own behavior, right? So if they want their plate back, all they have to do is keep the plate flat. So they focus on their own behavior and changing that in order to get the thing that they want, which is where behavior change actually is going to happen, is when they focus on self. They also keep their value over time. I don't need to spill more water to make the floor wet. I don't have to take the plate away farther away, aside from out of reach. I don't need to do more plate taking to get the point across. And they target the behavior, not the child. So it's really saying, I love you. You're awesome. You're a really cool kid. You just have to stop playing with the plate. That's something the child can do. They can see their behavior as something external from them, and they see that their adult is not mad at them. They're not targeting them. It's just saying, change that behavior. And so it really helps protect the relationship between the adult and the child, which allows for the adult to be a resource to the child during times when they are having a hard time and they don't have the skills to handle a situation. So let's talk about the framework. And then, of course, we're going to get into some questions. So the framework is not going to be a laundry list of logical consequences for, okay, what's the logical consequence for breaking a cup or for spilling your cereal or for hitting your sister? Like, we don't have to think of a laundry list for every single scenario, which I think parents often fear with logical consequences. Whereas the timeout chair is just like, oh, that's my one go-to thing. I don't have to think about anything else. So it's not actually that complicated. There are one question and one statement that we want to pay attention to. The question is, who or what was harmed? And the statement is, it's time to. So let's talk about the who or what is harmed first. So either the child has harmed a person, an object, or the community. Those are anyone, most things are going to fall into one of these three categories. The most logical consequence, if you are hurting someone and yourself is included in someone, if you are hurting yourself, the most logical consequence is that you need to be supervised to make sure that you don't hurt someone, right? So the most logical consequence is what we call a time in. That's you with me. So if you're not being safe, like at the park, if you're pushing kids, then the most logical thing to do is to have you come be with me for a moment. And then when you're ready to try again, I'm happy to have you try again. But if you go back and you push somebody, then you just come back to me for a little bit. And eventually you might have to leave the park, but that is the logical consequence, is that you need to be supervised if you're hurting people. If you're breaking things, the most logical thing is that you're not allowed to use that thing that you're breaking, right? It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to use anything in the entire house or home. It just means that you can't use the thing that you're breaking, with the idea that if that was removed and you go to your next toy and you're breaking that and that is removed, the child is going to start picking up on the fact that they will have very little available to them if they continue that behavior. And so with what is left, they stop breaking things. And that will show you, oh, I think I can bring this thing back. I think that your hands are ready and they're really safe. So the logical consequence of breaking something is you can't use it. And the logical consequence of impacting the health and well-being of the community is space from the community. That's the most logical thing to happen. And in the adults' experience, this would be like shouting fire in a crowded auditorium. If I go to a movie theater and I shout fire, they're going to ask me to leave the theater, right? If I'm making it seem like there's an emergency when there is no emergency, I'm going to be asked to leave the community for a little bit. Does that mean that I can't access any other community spaces? No, but I am going to be asked to leave that particular one. So in the example of the park, if I am repeatedly pushing, over and over and over, even when I do a time in as a little break and I go back, if I just keep going back and push, 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 at a certain point, like it's very clear that I'm going to start affecting the well-being of the entire community, that the entire all the kids of the park are going to start feeling unsafe with me there, in which case it makes the most sense to then leave the park altogether and to stop doing the time in. Does that mean that I need to be in timeout when I get home? No, it just means that I need to leave the community space that I was in. So I want to have a qualifier here, which is the chair, and to say that time from community is not inherently a timeout. Like that's not what we're saying. We're saying that they need space from the community that they're harming. So that's the goal of the logical consequence to community. So for example, if the child is, hitting the dog in the living room over and over and over, the dog isn't the one that leaves. The child has to leave. And maybe they go play in their room or in the kitchen or somewhere else where the dog isn't. That would be a logical consequence. Is if you're not going to be safe with the dog and you do that repeatedly, then you are not invited into this particular community space. So one of the things that tends to happen in the park example is that when we get home, we think that we need to then punish the child for their behavior at the park. The logical consequence was having to leave the park. It's already done. And so if the child comes home and they're very happy, they've almost forgotten what happened, they want to play soccer, they're wanting to do stuff outside, or they're picking up their toys, that's a good thing. And a lot of times we think that kids need to be unhappy during their consequence, when actually their happiness, their re-engagement, we can see they're being safe with materials, they're being pro-social, they're like speaking well, like all these things, these are good things for them to be practicing. And so it's good that you left the park, because now the child is spending part of their day in a really, really solid state of practice, whereas the park, that wasn't the case, and that's okay. So we don't need to go home and punish the child for their work at the park, and we actually want to celebrate the fact that they're being pro-social and engaging with things and having a fine afternoon. That just reinforces that we made the right decision to leave the park in that moment. The park wasn't working, and that's okay. So now let's talk about it's time to. So it's time to is a very special phrase that the child does not like. And the problem with this phrase is the child believes they're not doing anything wrong. So imagine the child, you're going to pick them up from their childcare, you're picking them up from somewhere, and it's time to leave that place. You go to the park and it's time to leave. From their perspective, they're like, I'm not pushing anybody, I'm playing nicely, like I'm not screaming, like everything is fine, and you're telling me I have to stop it all, right? So it feels like an unjust intervention from the child's perspective, is that they have these three basic freedoms. They have the freedom to speak, to move, and to choose, and they're allowed to do those things provided they're not hurting, breaking anything, or disrupting the community. And yet we're saying, sorry, this is not a choice. So it's not to say that we can't say this. We are adults who are caregivers of children, so we do need to say this. It is time to go to bed. It is time to brush your teeth. It is time to go to school. It is time to leave the park, right? So we are charged with providing care to young children, which means we need to make sure that their basic needs are met. But we have to understand that when we utter those words, the child has no buy-in, and that's why they're going to get really annoyed by this. So it still is time. It's just that we know that they're not going to be a fan of this. So we do need to have a logical consequence. And the most logical consequence to whenever you need to say it's time to is you can do this yourself, or I will help you do it. I'll give an example of an emergency. This is how I like to think of it. If I was in a classroom and all of a sudden I start seeing smoke at the back of the classroom, most of the kids don't notice it. And somebody is playing a game and they're right at a really good part of the game. And I say it's time to get out of the classroom. The child, especially a young child, will not understand, and they will likely want to continue doing their activity because they don't understand what's happening. In that moment, it's time to get out of the classroom. So if the child isn't going to move themselves out of the classroom, I'm going to move the child out of the classroom. That's part of my responsibility. It literally just needs to happen, regardless of the child's feelings about it. So that's the way that we want to see the logical consequences of it's time to is you're going to do it or I'm going to do it, but it is the thing that is going to happen. One thing I will say about the it's time to is we want to make sure that what we're saying is actually the next thing. So sometimes people will say, when the child is eating breakfast, we will say, okay, it's time to go to school. When actually what I want them to do is I want them to clean up breakfast. I want them to be done with that. But what happens though is the child here, it's time to go to school. And then the sensorial experience in their body is they don't go to school for 20 minutes. That becomes their definition. So when I say, when they're hearing, it's time to go to school, what they're hearing is, I have 20 more minutes. And then you start hearing the child pushing back when you say it's time to, simply because of that really long gap that their definition does not match yours. And so we have to be really clear about what it's time to. So when they're eating breakfast, if it's time to clean up, then that's the message. It's time to clean up breakfast. You can do that, or I can do that. Oh, I see you're not cleaning up. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the bowl. And then they go, oh, okay. So you can carry the bowl. And now we're off. But it has to be actually what's the actual thing that needs to happen right now is what I'm uttering in my voice. So until we're about to walk through the threshold of the door, I'm not saying it's time to walk to leave. So once I say it's time to leave, that means that we're going to move our bodies across the threshold of the door. And now it's time to leave means it literally is time to leave, not it's time to put on your shoes, it's time to find your backpack. So I want to give one example of when we're thinking holistically about this framework of jumping on the couch, and then we're going to break for Q&A. And I want to use this example because sometimes the child's behavior can fall under multiple of these categories. And what we want to do is we want to pick the one that is most aligned to our problem with their behavior. So some families are fine with kids jumping on the couch. Some families do not want kids jumping on the couch. It really is a personal choice. But you might, if you don't want kids jumping on the couch, you might think, okay, well, my problem with that is I think that the children are going to get hurt. So that would mean, if that's my problem with the couch jumping, that would mean that my logical consequence is going to be a time in. So that means that they can still access the couch. They just have to do it with me. But it also means that I'm saying that the choices you're making are not safe. And so you should just be with me. And I'm going to have to be with my child for a little bit around the home. So if that's what you want to impose, then that makes sense that that would be your limit. But you might also say, okay, I don't really think the children are going to get hurt. I'm more concerned about the couch, that I think this is going to break or damage the couch. And if that's your limit and you're worried about the couch getting broken or damaged, then the logical consequence would be, I don't have to be with you. You can be anywhere else in the space but the couch. You just can't be on the couch right now for a little bit, and then we're going to try again. But it depends on which you decide is the most important, what becomes the logical consequence. So if you have an infraction that you're like, oh my gosh, it's all of these, then you're going to decide what is the most important limit, and then what does that mean for the logical consequence, and is that actually the consequence that makes the most sense, right? So if I thought, I think that them hurting themselves is the most important, but then I think through logistically, do I want to just like walk around my home with my kid? Probably not. So I guess I'm going to go with the second best because it makes the most sense to me to actually say, you just can't use the couch right now. But you can do all sorts of other things. So when you think through logical consequences, you want to keep in mind, what is the limit you're establishing? And then what does that mean for the logical consequence? And then does that make any sense? the more you practice with logical consequences, the more the words will come freely with you. And so I would just dive in to a few, and then you might notice, oh, that was the wrong limit, or that was actually a punishment and that was not a logical consequence. The more you practice, the better at it you will be in all of these things. But I wanted to highlight the couch example because sometimes it can be confusing when it feels like their behavior is actually affecting more than one of these. So this brings us to our Q&A. I wanted to leave some time for us to chat. And so I'm going to come out of the screen share and be in community with you all. So thanks so much for watching, and hopefully see you in the Peace Program at some point soon.
Thank you so much, Mariana. I had amazing time, and I'm sure all our audience have also an amazing time listening to you. And the examples that you gave are so relatable. I'm sure that most of the parents will try to use it at home. And yeah, we all want
Good.
our audience to please join the Peace Program, and you will have a lot many insightful sessions with Mariana, and you will see me as well over there. So yeah, we collaborate, and yeah, thank you for attending the session today. You all have a great weekend ahead. Thank you, Mariana, for being here with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Madhuri, for hosting this. This has been really special to pop into some of Madhuri's work because she's been popping over to the Peace Program for so long. So thank you all for coming, for listening, and check out Madhuri's programs with Little Leaps and the Little Leaps School and over at the Peace Program as well. So hopefully see all of you over there in both spaces. And thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.